Okay, good evening. The Justice Ministry team at Central Christian wishes to welcome all of you here to this fifth session of the 3D series, The Voice of the Church in the Public Square. And I want to make a couple quick announcements before we get started. One is that there will be opportunities throughout this evening for people to be in dialogue with one another, to discuss, to raise questions, to make comments, and to get information. But if you have questions or comments or need some more information by the time we're finished, some of the members of the Justice Ministry team will stick around after we conclude to maybe answer questions or provide the kind of information that you might need. The second thing we want to say is that we are not planning to have a break per se. We're just going to go straight through. So at any time you need to take a break, feel free to do so. I mean, you will not interrupt us or bother us any. Just feel free to take a break whenever. I'd like for us to begin with an opening prayer. And I want to kind of set the stage for the prayer by sharing with you the words, according to Luke, that Jesus spoke at the very beginning of his ministry. This is from the 4th chapter of Luke, verses 16 through 19. Hear these words, and then we'll just go immediately into prayer. When he, that is Jesus, came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Join with me in an attitude of prayer. God of good news, God of the poor, God of the captives, of the blind, of the oppressed, we come before you this evening asking for you to help us understand that these words that Jesus uses to explain his ministry can also and should also be used to explain our ministry. We pray that the Spirit that was upon him will be upon us, working in us and through us, that we might continue to spread the good news by word and deed, that we might continue to find ourselves on the side of the captives and the blind and the oppressed and the poor, those who have no voice. And in doing so, may we forever proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. In the name of the one we seek to follow, even Jesus the Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Now, we've heard for the last 4 weeks a number of biblical and theological insights from Dr. Jerry Sumney and Dr. Paul Jones pertaining to the voices of the church in the public square. We've discussed God's values versus cultural values, the emphasis on community needs versus individual needs, individual sin and communal or systemic sin, the role of faith communities in societal issues, and so many, many more things. So the question we want to begin with this evening, because this is intended to be at least in part a time for discussion and question and comments. The question we want to begin with is, what is the one thing that you have heard from Dr. Sumney or Dr. Jones that alters the way you look at the church's involvement in the public square? What's the one thing that you've heard that really sticks in your mind and gives you a different way of looking at the church's involvement in the public square?
Go ahead. I believe that we need to speak out more, that we need to not be as passive as we have been, but to speak what we know are our values in the public square.
Speak out more.
Likewise, I've heard it's a Christian responsibility to be in the public square.
Yes.
to be in public square and to speak out. And do you have anything in particular in mind that you're thinking of when you're talking about speaking out, of what particular values you're thinking of?
Part of the problem is that it tends to be the issue of the day.
Let me see if others want to jump in on that. Anybody have any ideas about what has been most meaningful for you? What you've heard that has altered the way Jan, you have something you want to say?
Well, I want to say that for part of these, Kurt and I listened on a trip back from North Dakota, and it was some of the best listening we'd done in the car. I think I affirm what the Isherwood said. I also realize that there is a need for a community of faith to come to understanding that that we need to be able to talk about this despite our different backgrounds, that some method of communication needs to begin. And I'm aware that faculty at LTS have worked on this. But again, that need for conversation across what we look at as barriers now among our friends and members within our own congregation.
Have you seen examples of where that is taking place?
Leah Shade has worked very hard on getting congregations to have trusted conversations. She would certainly be a resource person. Jerry may remember the name of that, but they've tested it with a number of congregations. She received a grant for this, and it's specifically designed, if I'm correct, to build a trust level to talk without indicting each other, which can sometimes happen.
Okay,
Jerry,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
if Jerry's listening, I'd be curious to have him see if he could name Leah's program, because it escapes me right at this point.
He may have stepped away or something for the time being. You're
Isn't
talking
it
about,
about, Jan, isn't it about preaching in the purple zone?
Well, it addresses that, but it is separate from the role of a minister and addresses it as a congregational challenge and commitment.
And I can't think of the name either, but something I heard and playing back Jerry's last presentation this morning and then dovetailing with what Jan talks about. Sometimes we need to speak to the church, and two examples I want to give. Pennybacker just passed away, and Albert, and years ago he had arranged for Dr. King to speak at his church in Cleveland. The leaders of the church, at least some of them, locked the doors, so they held that discussion. Dr. King spoke from the steps of the church, and people gathered there. Another case in point is here at Central. I don't know how many of you remember Jerry Williams, but she wrote a letter to Dr. Moody saying, why aren't we open and affirming, or words to that effect? And Michael and Jan talked about it, and the discussion went to the elders, or the issue was referred to the elders. They used a book that Dr. Paul Sell was involved in writing to the churches that had come out of a work group at the national level of the disciples. It led to a resolution at a General Assembly, but also the book itself provided a framework for talking about, LGBT issues. And it was, anyway, it was Jerry raising the question, getting the question before the church, getting church leaders involved in the discussion. It was a 2-year discussion, if I remember, overlapping 3 classes of elders, but it's an example of the way that we can process things. And people didn't all come to agreement, but not very many of those, particularly those involved in the discussion, went away mad, and not many others did. So it can happen.
How can we, that's kind of internal thing where we're talking with ourselves, trying to come to some resolution, trying to come to some agreement, and at least understand where everybody's coming from. But how can we take that then out into the public square?
Well, with our welcoming statement, we took that out to the public square by our participation in Pride, the Pride events that happen each June or July, and made it visible that we affirmed that journey. I'm not sure how Central handled it back in the time of Martin Luther King. And I remember Dr. Pennybacker's comment about Martin Luther King preaching from the steps. You may have some sense of that, Paul. I don't know. But I think one is stepping out to events and celebrations and conversations in the public square and identifying that one is part of Central Christian Church. That's a very modest way, but it was a significant step, I think, for us relative to our statement of welcome.
Jerry, a little while ago, Jan was talking about a problem that Leah Shade is, or not problem, but a program that Leah Shade is involved in, helping congregations to have difficult conversations with one another. Do you remember the name of that?
Yes, it is Deliberative Dialogue.
Thank you.
And it's through the Kettering Foundation, and they have materials they can send you to help you get started. And some of us have been trained in how to facilitate that. So what it does is sort of try to give an objective sort of description of an issue, and then have people talk about it. So that basically what you do is identify the values that undergird the various positions taken on it. So it's a way to understand the differences without making a judgment about which one is right. So in a sense, as I would think about it, deliberative dialogue is a first step. So you identify those values, and then the job after that dialogue would be for the church to talk about whether the values that undergird each position are Christian values or cultural values. But that's not part of the deliberative dialogue sort of format. The format for deliberative dialogue is simply for people to have civil discussion that doesn't assume that one position is right and one position is wrong, but rather looks at why each side thinks they're right. And amazingly, you'll come up with some real commonalities as you do that discussion. As I've participated in some of them, that's the way it is. And it does help increase understanding. But again, for me, that's kind of a first step. And then you start to say, okay, let's evaluate those reasons for holding a particular position. But that would have to be, if you were going to use that method, another session, another conversation after you have thought about sort of why people hold the values they do.
What part of what the Tom and Betty Joe were talking about was getting out in expressing the Christian values in the public square. And that's kind of a step or two beyond what you're talking about. What about some of the rest of you? How can we express Christian values in the public square? What are some things that we can do or should do? Or what really struck you about these presentations that we've had from both Jerry Sumney and Paul Jones?
Well, for me, I've heard a lot from fellow members, and again, I'm from Dry Ridge Christian Church, but go around a lot of Christian churches, and a lot of younger people have taken a stance or belief that the statement is politics doesn't belong in the church. I get that part, but I think it's also you need to step back, and I think we need to help them understand as Christians, there are expectations as Christians in the political world. It doesn't mean you need to have politicians come forward, but it does mean that you can't use that as a way to get out of taking a stance or making your values known and hide behind that. And I think that is happening. I really do.
When the young people say that, according to what you've heard, are they saying they don't want partisan politics in the church, or they don't want some of these divisive issues in the church?
Sometimes I think it's both. I think they don't want, it's a lot of it is not coming forward, not feeling comfortable to make what their beliefs are known or their opinions, and can feel a little stymied, depending on who they're with or where they're from. And a lot of youth have not felt very comfortable coming out with open statements of how they feel about many things that are going in the world. And I think it's hard for them to connect with some of us older members.
I suppose one of the reasons could be they haven't made up their own mind about certain issues. And another part of it could be, I suppose, a fear of expressing an opinion and then being judged because of that, or being rejected by a peer group because of that. And that does bring up another interesting topic that we want to kind of throw out for people to consider, particularly in terms of what Betty Jo began our discussion this evening by talking about. We need to speak out more in the political realm, in the public square, as we're expressing our Christian values and working for our Christian values. And the question is, what holds us back? What do we need to learn or do or make a commitment to in order to move forward as individuals and as a community of faith in terms of expressing these values in the public square? What holds us back?
This is Tom Playbaugh, Matt. I know I'm not at the church now, but we were members there for a good 30 plus years. And I was on the board, the elders, when we adopted our current statement that about who we welcome and what people are expected to be part of our church. And I can tell you that even though it passed, I think finally unanimously, there was certainly discussion about several of the issues. And I think there are a number of people who probably left the church at that time over those issues. And I think the other problem with that is we're talking about Christian values, but there's not any, agreement among Christian churches about what those values are. And so that, you can talk about Christian values in your own church and in your own group of people. But if you look at the other non-disciple churches in Lexington, they certainly don't share those values, and they're very aggressive about not sharing those values. So I think that creates a problem in any group when you're going to exclude certain people's personal opinions. Now, how you go beyond that, I don't know. Thank you.
This is Patricia Creighton, and I think that too many of us are just too comfortable where we are. I have to admit, I suffer from that a little bit myself. And I look at how many people have attended these classes and think about how many members Central has. And, we're a pretty small group. And I know everything has to start somewhere, and this is maybe a tip of an iceberg, but this group would need to expand. And before we can make a voice in the public square, we need to have a little more, I think, a little more of a group that, has that's like-minded, so that we can maybe make a difference. I know one person can speak up, but a larger group can carry more weight.
This is Vicki, and listening to us talk, I think some of what I hear is a difference in terminology, because what I heard from both Jerry and Paul was they were not talking about Christian values, they were talking about God's values, which means it's not tied to a particular church's belief or how they do anything. God's values are, as we find in Scripture, and we saw them illustrated for us in the life of Jesus Christ. However, those justice values exist in the Torah. Many of those justice values exist in Islam. The values are not necessarily Christian, and when we put them as these are our, when we claim them in a certain way, it says that they are, that they belong to us, and they belong to God. Whatever they call the Creator, they belong to God. That's how He set up the world and how He intended life to go for everybody. That's what I got from all of what we listened to.
Thanks for sharing that with us.
It was helpful to hear more clearly the difference between individual sin and systemic sin. And I really have done some thinking about how we have typically, as people, want to absolve ourselves of any responsibility in the systemic sin. And we can't do that. And I think that's loud and clear for me. And really looking at the difference between cultural values and God's values. And somehow both those pieces of the conversation stuck with me as I was doing my own reflection of what have I done with that, and how, because for me, anything that we talk about, I have to go, okay, where am I at on this? And how have I misunderstood X, Y, and Z? And what do I take in, and what do I do whatever else with it? So those were helpful clarifying concepts for me. And I think what holds me back many times is, at least earlier in my life, a fear of being isolated. That didn't usually stop me, but I also was fearful of that. I mean, that's just a reality. Believe it or not, I know, John, some of you are laughing, but I was sometimes a radical, different. And
You
that
know,
wasn't always comfortable.
Connie, I agree with you. And the problem that I've had is that by being silent, I'm sometimes complicit in the systemic sin that we're talking about here.
Well, related to that, for me, when I look back on the 4 lectures that we've had, the 4 discussions that we had so far in this series, both from Paul and from Jerry, the thing that really strikes me more than anything else is that by definition, to be a follower of Christ is to be involved in the public square. I mean, that's how it struck me. It is a part of my being a disciple that compels me to be involved in some way or another. And with that in mind, I mean, thinking about ways to be involved, we do want to shift gears a little bit and concentrate on a couple of different areas of involvement in the public square. Now, I don't want to shut off anybody's comments or ideas. We can come back to those a little bit later if you so desire. But we do want to move into a time here where we can talk about some specific things that we can be involved in as far as getting involved in public square. And the most pressing at this moment in time, because of the time and because it is a civic responsibility, is the whole issue of voting. And John Zink is going to talk with us a little bit about the issue of voting.
Okay, thank you. I will. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back to what Vicky did, what Vicky commented on in terms of what she heard in some of the first 4 sessions, especially in the 4th session, where Jerry started it off pretty early by saying that God's desire for mercy and justice, for goodness and truth are God's values. So if those are God's values and we wish to try and move closer to God and God's values, as when it comes to the issue of voting, which in our particular society does make a difference as to what direction our society goes with its cultural values. When we decide which candidates to vote for, what values drive our decisions, what values do we vote for? So I'm going to open that for a little bit of discussion here too. What are the values that you look for in candidates?
I have a tendency,
Go ahead, Liz.
Honesty would be nice.
I have a tendency to listen for catchphrases that don't mean the same thing to someone else as they do to me.
I have one issue that really concerns me because it's complicated. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Okay. And it has to do with immigration. We talk about aliens and you know, God's values. And yet I just believe that you can't have a country without having a border and an immigration policy. And those seem to collide with each other in a lot of respects. And it puts you in a difficult situation when it comes time to vote, because in my mind, a country needs a border. And yet you would think God's values would say, no, you don't have a border.
I partly agree that, you know, you need a border. And in fact, you know, there was a consensus that evolved, what, in 2016 or something, around the issue of, I guess it was 2015, around the issue of immigration. It was a consensus statement for a kind of middle moderate group of Democrats and Republicans. It was rolling through the Senate, and then I think it was Rubio Cruz, I guess, that needed a filibuster to increase his visibility, and it just died on the vine. So I think there's recognition that there are some things that need to be, there are policy changes to be made that need to be made. There's not universal agreement, but there was enough agreement so that things could have been moved ahead. And the personal ambitions, I think, of a few senators killed the issue. So, you know, and I think it addressed the need for, quote, secure borders, for clarification of the entry process. It would have addressed probably the what we refer to as the DACA kids. So there have been attempts to address those issues that would recognize the need for border security, but also bring some order to that whole system.
It
You know,
does.
I
This
think
might be
one of
one
the
of those
things,
that would be, I hear some background noise and I'm not sure.
That's just, it used to be like, I can at buy this and fun and have
I
surprises.
can't tell what it's coming from. If everyone wants to mute.
Jerry, you were going to say something next.
Yes,
So.
absolutely, Jerry.
I think what I was going to say is that worrying about border security may be a concession of some of the values, but what can't be a concession is that the regulations that we have about it must be just and merciful. And those that we have in place are neither. Remember the kinds of instructions that were given to Israelites said that actually advantages should be given to those people who are vulnerable because God's people have suffered as the vulnerable and because that's the character of God. So it doesn't have to be a question of whether you have laws, but how they're shaped.
And I would quickly add to that the people who come in, whether they are accepted or not, need to be treated humanely.
Yeah. You know, there's just so much. Well, we don't have a lot of time tonight, so I'm going to move us a little bit farther ahead on this one. But immigration is certainly something that's broken right now and needs to be repaired at some point. And so, Jim, I think it was you that brought it up originally, right? And so what I hear is you tended to look for candidates that would be interested in coming up with a immigration policy that works. Maybe some of the characteristics voiced by people here. There's a lot of issues. I mean, we could go on all night on things like affordable housing, health insurance, livable wages. I didn't say minimum wages. I said livable wages. Okay. More equitable tax structure, clean water, safe food, voting rights, creation care. I mean, there's just so much that we could talk about that we would want to listen fairly carefully to our candidates for their positions, their policies, and maybe compare them to God's values of justice, goodness, and truth and mercy. As we move to helping you in terms of the issue of voting, probably you've already made your decisions about coming up on the 8th, who you're going to vote for. And if so, that's great. The justice team has struggled with how to be a justice people in the public square. And one way we feel it's important to be a justice people is to become an informed voter, know the candidates at the federal, which we talked about from an immigration perspective, but also at the state and the local level. We need to stop and explore the values they profess, attend some of the programs that they do in terms of speeches, attend some of the programs that are provided by organizations such as the League of Women Voters, which is nonpartisan, and they have links that you can listen to candidates' positions on things where they've had candidates speak. You can research bills and policies. If they've been in office before, you can take a look at their voting record. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can say, what values is this candidate expressing based on what I hear from him and what I've seen as actions from him or her. So consider that way you can say how, then you next can say, how do those values line up with my values? But more importantly, how do they line up with the values of Jesus, a man of peace, justice, and inclusion? So there are some links that were provided to you in the October 21 Friday e-blast, e-news, and I will send out an email that provides you those links again after this session is done to everybody that's on the screen here. I also received an email today from the League of Women Voters that gives about 4 different links to finding out what district you're in and that type of thing, and does have links to some of the sessions where the candidates have spoken. So it's a way to begin to educate yourself for next Tuesday, if you haven't already decided. Okay. So with that, the next 4 things that we're going to be talking about, the Justice team has vetted 4 organizations that we have evaluated and determined are truth-oriented organizations, if you will. And so we're going to talk about those organizations, but at the very least, they are certainly voicing in the public square their positions. And so we're going to talk about those. And let's see, is it Margetta? Are you next in terms of the first one?
Well, before Margetta starts, let me say also that these 4 different organizations not only have been vetted, as John said, but they're a part of the strategic plan that we have, and they have been approved by our board of directors. Having said all that, Margetta is going to talk with us about BUILD.
Thank you. I'm going to give a brief overview of BUILD, and which offers us a good way to be engaged in the public square, I believe. Building a united interfaith Lexington through direct action. BUILD is a coalition of 27 congregations working together to solve serious community problems. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is made up of congregations that are religiously, racially, and geographically diverse. BUILD works to address the root causes of community problems in the city. We build our power by joining with congregations across our community to bring hundreds together annually in a large Nehemiah action to pressure public officials to solve serious community problems. And BUILD has made a significant difference on a number of issues. We are currently addressing 3 important issues: affordable housing. In 2014, we were successful with establishing an affordable housing fund with $2 million in annual funding to address the critical lack of affordable housing in our city. We defended this fund in 2020, and last year we won an investment of $13 million. So far, over 3,000 families are housed because of these efforts. We are currently focusing on attaining a dedicated revenue source that will guarantee money for future years. Mental health care. Many people in our community struggle to access mental health care due to lack of, limited, or inefficient public transportation to get to appointments and to the pharmacy for prescriptions. In our conversations with mental health care workers, transportation was cited as the key barrier to people receiving the mental health care services that they need. An example was, after a crisis, only 1 in 5 people discharged from Eastern State Hospital make it to their first follow-up appointment. We are working to ensure efficient and appropriate transportation for people dealing with serious mental illness. Gun violence. BUILD continues to support GVI, the Group Violence Intervention Strategy, to address the rising gun violence and murders in our city. In 2019, we were successful in getting Mayor Gray and the council to bring the National Network for Safe Communities staff to Lexington for a problem analysis. The analysis was completed in 2020 after Mayor Gorton took office. The analysis concluded that GVI would significantly reduce violent crime in Lexington. However, Mayor Gorton has refused to follow through on this recommendation. There are several ways to be involved with BUILD. Become a member of the Justice Ministry Network. Bring at least 3 people to the Nehemiah Action on April 24th. This is the key to building the power we need to get public officials to act on our serious community problems. Taking part in the Nehemiah action is critical to our success. Attend 3 other citywide meetings to prepare for and follow up from the Nehemiah action. The Community Problems Assembly, which will be held November 7th at 6:30 at Consolidated Baptist Church. We will hear about the latest research results on the 3 issues that we're taking up and how we plan to move them forward. There will be a rally in April to discuss the results of the research teams, and that information will be used to help plan for Nehemiah action. And in June, we gather to celebrate what we've won and begin the investment drive. You can also volunteer to be on a research team where we meet with experts in the fields of concern to gain information and understanding, taking that information and identifying a solution by examining those results, those expert opinions, and look at what other people, places have done, how did it work, and make decisions about how to solve problems. Then we meet with public officials to present reasonable, well-researched proposals. Provide ongoing information to our congregations. And those meetings, research meetings, are on Zoom, and they will officially begin in December, although there's one tomorrow on mental illness issues. So they continue for about 4 months, and then we have something to present to the public officials who can make decisions and make a difference in our city and with the city problems. Other events that may occur based on concerns that arise from time to time are prayer vigils, car rallies, and press conferences. If you're not a member of the Justice Ministry Network, I'd encourage you to become a member and be a part of making a real difference in our city.
Thank you, Margetta. And again, if anybody needs more information on that, contact anyone on the Justice Ministry team or Margetta, and we can get additional information. I'm sure everybody wasn't able to write down all those dates and everything, but we can get that to you. The next group we want to talk about is the Poor People's Campaign. And Vicki is going to talk with us about that a little bit. Vicki, you're muted. You're muted. We can't hear you.
See, it's much better when I'm muted, then you don't have to listen to me. Poor People's Campaign. Poor People's Campaign is a broad fusion movement to unite poor and impacted communities across the country with common goals. Some of the common goals that have been a part of Poor People's movement from the beginning are systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, militarism and the war economy that drains money, the distorted moral narrative of religious nationality or nationalization, and the other is voting access. At the moment, they are concentrating on voting. They're concentrating on getting people to the polls because they believe that one of the major ways that makes a difference is for people to go and vote for candidates who support the poor, who don't make war on the poor, who support health care for people, who support good education, who support all the values that they believe that people are entitled to according to God's justice. It was founded by a disciple minister, Dr. William Barber, who is a marvelous preacher, and you can hear him if you bother to look it up anywhere. You can hear him preach at many, many occasions. He has recently been preaching in Jackson, Mississippi, about the water problem that they have in Jackson, Mississippi, about the unfairness of how the water system is set up there. The Poor People's Campaign goes state by state, and it deals with each state and its problems. There is a Kentucky Poor People's Campaign that if you are on Facebook, if you look it up, you can see what is being done and what is being promoted in Kentucky. Right now, again, they're promoting the Kentucky voting. They're saying that on the Kentucky ballot, people need to be aware of living wages, health care, voting rights, affordable housing, and all those issues appear with various candidates who are on the Kentucky ballot. But you can see the various services that have been held. Dr. Barber just held one Sunday, a magnificent preaching effort on voting. Paul Medford and I went to DC. The church was Paul Medford and I went to DC in June for the Poor People's Campaign March. There have been several demonstrations in downtown Lexington held by the Poor People's Campaign. I went to one a couple of weeks ago. Starting in January, several of us have gone to Frankfurt on legislation days. Connie, Cindy Miller, Jenny Shirey, I think Margetta went, but have gone to look our Kentucky legislators in the face and say, are you really going to vote for that? And that the people, the Poor People's Campaign and their right for other people, their care for other people says you need to care about your constituents and not about your income or about the income of your special forces. The belonging to the Poor People's Campaign, look up poorpeoplescampaign.org online. You can go in online and you can join and begin to get their emails and their notifications of the various activities that are going on. Same thing is true of Kentucky Poor People's Campaign. If you want to keep it local, go online and check and become a part of their mailing list, and you will be given notification of when their events are going to be taking place. And it's a chance to stand in public or with other people and say, we believe in God's mercy and God's justice. It is a nonpartisan group. They're dealing only with the issues of right and wrong. They don't care what you put, an issue you put by your name, R or D. What they care about is the issue right or wrong for God's people. If you have any other questions, let me know.
We are truly an inclusive group too. I mean, it's rich and poor,
Absolutely.
educated and uneducated. I mean, it's very, very inclusive.
And there are a lot of the stories, they tell stories. They're storytellers. And so they tend to have people tell their story of what's going on in their life individually. That is a part of the Poor People's Campaign, yes. But as a fusion, that's the word, because they have a huge group of people who shouldn't be all working together, but they're trying to draw people whose common interests are that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Vicki. We need to move along, and we're going to talk a little bit about Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. And Connie is going to lead us in that discussion.
Kentuckians for the Commonwealth have been around for a couple decades, 4 decades, basically. And you can be a member as an individual. One of the things that was interesting when some of us went to Frankfurt was that the presence at Frankfurt was joint between Poor People's Campaign and Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, because they do some of the same kinds of things and they combine numbers and forces in order to be a bigger group. So that was, it's always good to see groups working together. It is a grassroots organization of thousands of members across Kentucky. They have local chapters all across Kentucky, in the rural areas, the city areas. There's one for Bluegrass, which is the central Kentucky area, and I've attended some of those meetings. They use a set of core strategies from leadership development to communications and voter empowerment to impact the broad range of issues. And the issues the cluster of issues are coal and water, because of what it does to Eastern Kentucky particularly, new energy and the transition to different sources, economic justice, which includes so much of what's already been mentioned, and voting rights. So I wanted to just say a little bit about it. It's kftc.org. They are one of the resources that would be able to provide a voter guide in terms of who to vote for. Or they don't say who to vote for, but they talk about, you can find out what the candidates are for and against. So that's what they attempt to do. is another a grassroots people group. So we try to keep things, I know we got one more to talk about, but I want to make a plug. We put a lot in Friday News and in Chimes. So hopefully you've been seeing that and you may be more mindful of looking for that in terms of opportunities coming up and updates, et cetera.
Okay, Connie, thank
That's
you
it
very
for me.
much. And we want to hear also about the Kentucky Council of Churches, and Kurt is going to lead us in that discussion.
The Kentucky Council of Churches goes back, it grew out of the Sunday school movement of the 19th century. Charlie Coyle was very active in that for years. Bob Stauffer, who's here somewhere, has been on and been active. Elizabeth has been on the board. The purpose is, shorthand, is witnessing to Christian unity through relationships and actions. It's first of all an attempt to develop relationships at the judicatory level between the bishops and of the various Catholic dioceses. We were one of the first states to include the Roman Catholics. Yeah, our equivalent would be the regional minister. Each of these folks appoints delegates to the board and to the annual assemblies. There are several commissions to carry out the work of the council. One of those is the Commission on Justice and Advocacy. And that's charged with developing consensus policy statements for consideration by the board and the assembly for fostering mutual support in the area of justice and advocacy within the framework of those statements, and developing relationships with other coalitions like the Poor People's Movement and the Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, depending on the issue. One of the strengths of the council is that for them to speak publicly on most issues, there needs to be one of these consensus policy statements. And those are statements that combine factual data with sort of theological statements that reflect and are consistent with all of the participating judicatories. That's a strength. It's also a weakness, because when you get the Catholics in and the more progressive Protestants, there are some issues we're not going to agree on and not be able to address. Even with those issues, I think there's a consensus that all persons should be treated with dignity and have access to health care, although you'll get into some of the finer points on healthcare. Advocacy activities include testimony by the executive director or a designee before legislative committees. There are ways for individuals to participate. During most sessions, there's a way to sign up for legislative alerts. They've held what they call days of prayer and action. This goes back 4 directors. I think Vicky's made a few of those. They're held at the Capitol, I think, on a monthly basis. It's always been a day when we had grandkids. So, and each time we'll have a presentation on a specific topic. There are opportunities for lay people and clergy as well to join the working commissions of the council. And you can attend the assemblies as either a interested person or as an appointed delegate from, in our case, the Disciples of Christ. Going back to an earlier issue, they had a few sessions that focused on civil dialogue. And the one I remember, even though, anyway, was on abortion, featuring the former director of the council and the head of the Catholic advocacy group. And I remember one of the Catholic leaders saying, I learned that there's a difference between being pro-choice and being pro-abortion, which kind of gave her a different perspective. I think for me, the difference in perspective was finding out that even though the Catholic Church has a strong statement against abortion, the better priests still will tend to the needs of the people involved in those difficult situations. Some of the issues that the policy statements go back to the 90s. They get revised periodically. Some of the issues are the ones we've talked about. There's one on Christian principles in an election year. It's got 10 points for consideration, and both for the candidates and for voters. Affordable housing, they helped move along the state level affordable housing action. And that, shucks, I should remember the central member that brought that up, but I'm failing right now. Racism, gun violence, gun safety, domestic violence, and immigration. Those statements can be found on the website, and I've provided Connie with a list of links. The statements are helpful because they do give you kind of that faith grounding on talking about these issues. I'd encourage you to go out and take a look at those. I'll stop there. But
Okay, Kurt, thank you very much. And if anybody is interested in more information about any of these groups, feel free to contact the person who presented or contact anyone on the Justice Justice Ministry team.
Steve, can I make a comment about the groups?
Yeah.
I'd like to be sure that you're aware that the Justice Ministry team has vetted these groups based on the fact that they are indeed nonpartisan, are focused on issues of justice and mercy and truth. They try to speak the truth. And so I wanted to emphasize that that's part of at least when I was looking at these groups, my perspective of what I thought they represented, nonpartisan, but truth.
Oh, another piece of it for me is, particularly in the case of the Council and Build, is that you're not just getting a lot of people following one person. The issues percolate up, and then get approval by the larger group. To me, that's part of the vetting process.
John, do you have that list of the key points that we wanted to show on screen?
I don't.
I've got them ready to go.
Okay.
You want to show those?
You sure, Connie?
Get it moving.
Connie, that's not the right one. I'm not seeing the right one.
There it is.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, where it says key points, people have the option of enlarging that from their own computer.
I can enlarge it too.
Okay, that may be better for you to do it.
Maybe a
Does that
bit.
help you all?
That may be a bit small since you can only see about 5 of them. A bit large.
That's better.
Okay.
Okay, as you look at these the key points that are mentioned here, these were sent out earlier. So presumably many of you have had the opportunity to look at this before. And the question we want to raise is, does anybody have any strong desire or burning desire to talk about any one of these in particular? We can give it a couple more minutes here if anybody has anything, any questions or comments about any of these particular points.
I think in some ways it would be helpful for us to take a look at in some way at the cultural values that shape us, that we think are God's values, because I think that happens to us. Of cultural value becomes so ingrained and so promoted that it seems like it's God's value. And I think that crossover is where we have a certain amount of problem with talking to other people, because we like us, they have taken a cultural value and have assumed that it's God's value. And I think that requires some discussion and some discrimination.
Let me ask what we have, I'm not able to see the gallery at the moment. All I see are these key points, but can we ask Jerry and Paul if they would like to comment on how we begin to determine the difference between, well, what is a cultural value? What is God's value? There's got to be some places where they overlap. There's got to be some places where they're just very different. Any suggestions that Jerry or Paul might want to make?
Since Jerry wants to mute me, I'll speak first. I think Jerry has done an excellent job of identifying what we would call God's values. And the source for that, the primary source would be the Bible, but also tradition as well. So I think that's something that Central does exceedingly well. And the Justice team obviously does well. The more difficult task, as Vicky's indicated, would be to identify cultural values. In the same way that you have a plurality of so-called Christian values, you have a plurality of cultural values. So the question would be, what's the matrix that we would use to identify those values? Because the public square doesn't have a unanimous voice. It simply has multiple voices. So I think that's a serious question that we need to address. And the way in which we would go about doing it is simply to listen to, identify certain vehicles, whether it be social media, whatever the modality of communication is, and begin to hear what themes are prominent and what themes are consistent. We can talk about American values in terms of people like John Meacham and things like that. And then we can talk about public values in terms of how the political discourse distinguishes between those sets of competing public political voices. My bias would be to start obviously with God's values and use that then as a template by which we would overlay onto our conversation, our inventory of what we would call cultural values. So instead of trying to create independent spheres, we would simply start with the more difficult task of trying to identify, I think, God's values, ones which Jerry has achieved exceedingly well for us, and then use that as a way to evaluate the other values that seem to be prominent in our culture. If that makes sense for a process.
Okay.
That is, as members of a Christian community, our bias is to, what should we say, to in some way or another, we need to prioritize what we consider to be God's values, knowing that is up for discussion. But there are attributes, qualities, tenets that we would want to appropriate as a way to which to critique what we would consider to be alternative voices in the marketplace. Tag, Jerry.
Yeah, I think what I would say is that the basic starting point is the character of God, and that it is the call of the church to live out the character of God. And so we evaluate every other value by whether it coheres with who God is and who we know God to be in Christ, who we know God to be in Scripture, and it's in the dominant witness of Scripture, and who we know God to be in the tradition of the church. And so we can start to evaluate things that are seemingly truisms by whether they cohere with the character of God. So God's justice, God's goodness, God's mercy, God's truth. And that seems to me to be the way we make the distinction between cultural values and Christian values. And I would say that for the most part, Christian values in this sphere cohere well with humanitarian values. They don't cohere so well with nationalistic values. So that it is those broader understandings of the good of all human beings and the good of creation that reflects who God is that help us determine which values really do cohere with the faith and which ones we have adopted because they have promoted a kind of understanding of how you get ahead, of who should be advantaged in our culture, and those kinds of things.
It always sound like a alternate conspiracy theorist, but the book club that I know Jan and I think several of you are involved in discussed a book that traced the deliberate effort by some of the corporate community to align themselves or be seen as being aligned with the church and with Christian values. And this goes back probably to the 30s with a bigger push in the 40s with a different kind of push in the 40s and 50s. So for example, and I know Jerry, you talked about this as an example, the idea that the only purpose of a corporation is to give the highest possible return to its shareholders, and never mind who's getting cheated out of their land or whose community or water is being polluted or whatever, or what it does to the carbon levels that we're dealing with. We hear some every time there's a proposal to help people with federal funds or government monies, there's a very quick response that that's socialism, because capitalism is God's way, and it's very narrow, a much narrower definition of capitalism than Adam Smith ever had, the so-called father of capitalism. Those are barriers we have to overcome or deal with when we start to talk about these issues in the public square. Because I think it's so ingrained that there is an American way of doing these things. And actually it hasn't always been the American way of doing those things.
May I piggyback onto that, Kurt? I think what Jerry and you are saying, for me, underscores the failure of the church in terms of its capacity to create what I would call Christian identity. I hesitate to use that phrase because of the movement called Christian nationalism. So I'll say that using Christian language, and now I want to say that using more neutral language. Human beings obviously are social critters, and we are socialized and enculturated intentionally into our identity. Starting with a nuclear family and moving out concentrically. The problem of the church in the American context, for me, is that at best we're at church an hour, 3 hours, 5 hours a week. Seldom do we do any serious study, whether it be biblical, theological. We don't get together. We don't reaffirm our rootedness. We don't have tap roots, whether they be spiritual tap roots, theological, biblical, social tap roots. And so by definition, the dominant cultural voice, or at least the voice in our subset, wins by default. because it's constant, whether it be TV or social media, whatever it is, those are shaping our values. Those are shaping our identities, and we don't even know it because it's just, part of the larger cultural scene. So I think part of what, and it's hard for me, I'm a child of the 60s, like most of you all. I cut my teeth on movements, particularly when I was in college, and I wasn't worried about spiritual taproots. But I think the problem that we have today is that our taproots are very shallow and thin and short, and therefore we get persuaded very easily. And what the church, I think, needs to do is exactly, what Jerry's been talking about. That is, we have to make sure we are anchored and grounded in our tradition and in our theological language, and which produces our values and our norms and our identity, and use that then as the vehicle, which many of you obviously are embodying every day in terms of your practice, so that we aren't as susceptible to the cross currents of the culture. So my plug is for Central and for the church at large to be more intentional about creating formation practices that will, in some sense, both motivate and inspire, but also to allow us to look beyond the immediate horizon, so we don't become so pessimistic or even cynical because we don't see the larger biblical portrait, if you will. So I apologize for that little sermonette, but I think we need to recognize the fact that we need to be grounded and also at the same time active. They're not false dichotomies. They're requirements in terms of mutually reinforcing one another. Thank you for your time.
How does the bureaucracy of the church and the fact that we have huge buildings with massive overheads to take care of impact the possibility of developing those taproots that you're talking about?
That sounds like a 60s question, Steve.
Well, you said you were a child of the 60s.
Yeah, I didn't worry about institutional care back in the 60s and early 70s.
Well, I don't think it's quite that dichotomy. When I grew up in a conservative church, and we had church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. We had religious education. We had that counter in culturalization. And I remember I didn't get to play Little League baseball because it was on Wednesday night and I had to go to church. And you know what? That was good for me. It meant that Christian values were more important than this engagement with a cultural institution. And it meant that I got an education in what it meant to be a Christian. And I didn't like it when I was a kid. and probably for a long time after that. But I think it speaks to what Paul's talking about. It was a matter of prioritizing what identity we were going to take on. And that was an important lesson, no matter what it involved.
So at a very early age, you had to say goodbye to your professional baseball career.
That's right. And baseball has been fine without me.
But there is, I think that idea of parents saying to their children, you're not going to be in soccer or baseball at this particular time because we have responsibilities at the church. We're going to be at the church. We're going to be at this event or that event or whatever. I think that happens less and less.
I think that's right. And I think that we don't value which of those decisions we make.
Let me see if some other people want to jump in on this conversation.
Well, on the other hand, I think Central has done a fairly good job. Youth Sunday a couple of years ago, you know, the kids talked about Micah. I never heard about Micah until I was in college. You know, they've helped buy shoes for the homeless. You know, they've learned some of those hands-on issues that, you know, I can remember in 9th grade kind of having this aha experience in youth group that, gee, there are people out there that aren't as comfortable as we are, you know. But again, I'm just kind of amazed that our kids have learned about the social justice scriptures 10 years before I ever heard of them, you know.
I mean, I don't think it matters for right now.
Something I've been thinking about, I don't know if my internet's going in and out. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going back to a question that was asked, what keeps us from, and it fits with all this, I think. The phrase that I have heard a lot over the many years of doing anything related to especially mercy ministries is people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I did, and they should. So to me, in light of all this discussion from the last 4 weeks, that may be something keeping some people from doing things. They should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And maybe that's more of an Eastern Kentucky thing. I don't know where it comes from, but I know that resonates with some of you. But I think that keeps us from. Our cultural values at times can keep us from helping or being involved because we really don't think people deserve it. So I haven't even asked that question, but do people deserve it? Do we believe people deserve our unconditional care?
My initial response to that one, Connie, that assumes they've got bootstraps.
And that's my thought too, absolutely. But I thought about that in terms of if that's where someone believes, and that's a cultural value, that is not God's value, then, and I'm sounding like a preacher, so you preachers can, you know, I didn't go to any of Dr. Sumney or Dr. Paul's classes, so I'm not going to do well at this. But, you know, if that's our value and that's what we operate from, then we're not going to be able to do anything for other people. So do we need to name it? Do we need to say, do we really care about these folks? I don't mind asking this group per se, but I wonder if a basic lack of caring for groups of people different for us keep us from acting. I am done.
I want to share something that happened at God's Pantry. There are rules at God's Pantry. You have to go through the main pantry to make an appointment. You can only get certain foods once a month, and we're supposed to abide by that. But then we have this one particular man that keeps coming in, and he doesn't want to sign up. He just wants food, and he doesn't speak English, and he keeps saying chicken, and we're all calling him the chicken man because he comes like 2 or 3 times a week. What do you do if you have, you know, you want to help, but then you have these rules? And maybe that's some of the other things that hold people back from helping others too. They're trying to go by what they consider the rules are or the laws are. That's a small example, but you know, it's really bothering me. I feel like just buying some chicken tenders and having them there for him every day.
Well, you know, I think one of the things that we have to note is that you said that this person barely speaks English, so he may not be able to participate in the system as it's set up.
Right.
And I think that mercy always has to exceed the bounds of the usual rules that we have. So I don't know exactly what that means in his case because I don't know him, but I do know that rules shouldn't keep people hungry.
Connie, could you take the key points off the screen so we could go back to the full gallery? Okay, thank you. I think one of the issues with regard to the rules, one of the questions that comes to my mind immediately is to wonder, are the rules an expression of the kind of mercy that Jerry is talking about, or the kind of values of God's kingdom that we've been talking about? One must also look at the rules.
That's true. Yes. Sometimes the rules and the laws are biased where people can't get help.
That brings me to Helping Hands, where Catherine asked everybody to have an ID when they come in, so that we can keep track of who's coming through Helping Hands and how frequently they come and that type of thing. But do you know what? And a person comes in and says, I don't have an ID, she lets them go through.
Mm-hmm.
To speak to one issue, I think the issue that Kurt alluded to in terms of Smith and capitalism and those types of things. And he also referenced a book at that point. The issue I want to speak to, though, is what Jerry brought up at the last 3D session, the fourth one. And not everybody on the screen right now was at that one. And I want to raise up the book that Jerry said was probably a pretty good book by Edith Rassell, Rassell. Its title is The Way of Abundance, Economic Justice in Scripture and Society. The first 3 chapters talk about things like ancient Israelites, the time of the monarchy, Jesus in Rome, and Roman Palestine. But then the last 3 top chapters, I haven't read them, Jerry, yet, but you could speak to this if you want to, sort of speak to us more current day, as it talks about elements of just economy, biblical economic justice in today's economy, and moving toward economic justice. So I just wanted to make sure that the people who weren't present last week had an opportunity to be aware of this book. I've skimmed pieces of it and it looks pretty good.
Yeah, I've started reading it, John, and I agree. It looks very good.
Yeah, Jan.
I think the book that Kurt was referring to, I'm not recalling the author, but the title is The Sum of Us.
Yeah.
And it's
Is that Heather
insightful
McGee?
and disturbing.
Heather McGee, isn't it?
Heather
Yeah.
McGee, right.
Well, I hope that this discussion this evening has been beneficial. I know it has been for me. I hope it has been for you as well. We are coming close to the end of our time together, and we want to honor the time commitment so that we can bring this discussion to a conclusion at or about 8:30. Some of us will stick around afterwards if you have questions or want more information about contacts, how you can get in contact with different organizations that we have mentioned. We want to conclude in a way that is a little bit different, and that is we want to have everybody together read these words from James chapter 2, verses 14 through 18. And I don't know how it is for your screen, but I'm having trouble seeing that whole thing.
Oh, that's not good, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, she made it too big.
There you go.
What we would like for you to do is to mute yourself so that everybody is muted. But we want to read this together. I will stay on and we'll read it out loud, but you read along with me.
It's a little bit too big, Connie.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, can you, I hope everybody can see that now. Does that look good to you, John?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody is on mute, but we're going to read this out loud together. And I will lead us, and this is our kind of benediction for the evening. Let's read this together. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm, and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply
Steve, you got muted, sorry. Start back with verse 16. Unmute yourself first, there you go.
All right, let me start all over again with verse 14. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I, by my works, will show you my faith. Amen. And go in peace. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for the great job, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
John, how did I get